Hey, I'm gonna try to do this all in one take. I recently was watching a Colin Baker interview where he talked about how he didn't really like how he saw all these lists of either stories or doctors, and they went one to whatever was the worst. So in this case, we have either 13 or 14 doctors. When he was actually talking, he was talking about 12 doctors. And he would often be ranked near the bottom. But he said that it was more that it was inconsiderate and it was sort of dehumanizing to see people who would put all this work into creating art and to see them put at the very bottom of lists of people who are actually very passionate about their work. But at the same time, I really like making lists. I like ranking things. I like ranking doctors. So I've sort of decided to find a middle ground, and instead of ranking all the doctors, I'm going to make two lists and rank the classic and modern era doctors separately without ever combining lists or comparing the two officially in list form. So here goes. I'm going to try to do this in one take and see what happens. And while I'm going, I'm going to talk a little bit about the stories that each doctor has that are really stand out and important. And I might touch a little bit on a few other things that are relevant to these doctors' eras. Okay, now in eighth place for classic doctors, I have a doctor I really like. He's not the worst doctor at all by any stretch, but Peter Davison. I know a lot of people are probably expecting Colin Baker, but I really like a lot of his work, and I've been listening to his Big Finish stuff lately, and I'm really impressed. And I really like a lot of Peter Davison's work, but at the same time, I feel like his portrayal of the Doctor was less stand out. He was very much a very human Doctor, and a lot of his stories just don't stand out to me in a way that makes them particularly memorable. I mean, I'll rewatch them. I like all of them at least a little bit, but in comparison to the other Doctors, it's not quite as impressive typically, though he does have a couple standout stories, and I'm going to talk about a few of them. Well, Enlightenment is actually my favorite Peter Davison story. Now, a lot of people would say The Caves of Androzani is his best story, but Enlightenment is just really weird and hard to describe and just dark fairy tale adventure pirate story in space with the interdimensional beings. It's kind of amazing and honestly one of the best things Doctor Who has ever done. Now, of course, I did mention The Caves of Androzani, and just because it is actually really good, a little bit overrated but really good, you should probably check that out if you're really wanting to get a feel for what attracts people to that Doctor, why he is so often credited as being a great Doctor, and that story is praised pretty much universally in the fandom. It's a really strong serial, which is his regeneration story, and is beautifully directed, well written. He gives a great performance. Nicola Bryant gives a great performance. And I won't get too into spoilers, but it's very, very good. David Bowie, I believe, was actually supposed to play the villain originally, but he wasn't able to due to scheduling conflicts. But the guy that they did get in to play the villain is fantastic, and he gives a real creepy vibe that you just feel uneasy when you're watching him on the screen. Now, moving on to seventh place in the classic Doctor ranking, I have the original Doctor, William Hartnell. Now, he gave a really great performance. William Hartnell was a fantastic Doctor. Now, a lot of people will criticize him for messing up his lines a lot, but I do realize that wasn't intentional, but it does work in the canon because his Doctor is supposed to be very old, sort of towards the end of his life, and having difficulty going on. He's a senile character. He can't remember how to work the TARDIS. He is in a state of relative confusion a lot of the time. And when the Doctor flubs a word, has to repeat himself, gets someone's name wrong, I do know the name thing was occasionally scripted, but when he does get something wrong, it works in the story and it doesn't detract from it. It actually adds to the characterization, which works really well. Now, that said, he is in 7th place on the Classic Doctor list. Now, a lot of this doesn't have a lot to do with him failing in his performance or anything. It's the fact that he was the first Doctor. We built a lot on the eccentricity, the alienness of Doctors after that. And generally speaking, I'm just not a massive fan of pure historicals. I really do like some of them. I recently listened to Marco Polo, which is a missing story. I listened to the audio for that, and that was really good. And I've watched the Aztecs many times. I also really liked the Romans, which is a little bit too tongue-in-cheek and humorous for some people, but I found it impressive. But still, his stories are not, generally speaking, my favorites. Some of my favorite stories are in his era, but typically just the approach of his era isn't quite what I look for in Doctor Who, but he did create the character. We built from that in a lot of interesting ways since then, and we wouldn't have Doctor Who without him. So really, if you're a fan, you owe it to yourself to check him out, because he was the only Doctor for the start of the show, and a big part of the core of the Doctor's character is formed in this era. Now, his stories that I would suggest include An Earthly Child, but I wouldn't suggest... the whole story is good, but really episode 1 is the only part that's mandatory viewing. It's the first story in the first episode in the entire history of Doctor Who, and it is really great. It's atmospheric viewing. Great performances all around, and it really kind of plays like the beginning of a horror movie, where if they had done differently, it would work perfectly fine as like a B movie where the Doctor just murders everyone in the next episode, in the next half, and you wouldn't really be surprised. You're given the impression that this Doctor isn't someone to be trusted. It's Doctor Who, because who is he? What's he up to? And that's a really interesting vibe to start a series around, especially when you name the show after the character. Now, the second story I suggest would be the Dalek invasion of Earth. This is really where the Doctor becomes a hero. It's Susan's exit. It's a great big invasion story. I believe it's actually the first invasion story on Earth in the history of Doctor Who. So we get to see the Daleks, this alien threat, finally coming back to bite humanity. And it's also, in a larger sense, a story about what would have happened if Britain or the Allies had lost World War II. It's what Nazi-occupied London would look like, and it's really, really cool and creepy and fun. And it has a really bittersweet ending in which the Doctor gives a wonderful speech that has gone on to become an iconic moment in the history of the show. You pretty much owe it to yourself to check this out. Now, the next story I'm going to mention is The Keys of Marinus, which isn't really at a lot of people's best stories. It's not on a lot of lists that I've seen, but it's so cool. Every episode is set in a different part of this really diverse planet. You've got snow and brains in jars and weird mountain men and a murder trial, and it just so many cool conflicting bits that probably shouldn't work together, but it comes together in this great serial where you really start to feel that Doctor Who is a story that can go anywhere and do anything. And I think the fact that they expanded their storytelling techniques to that is a big part of why the show has gone on today. Now, the last story I'm going to suggest is The Sensorites. I've seen some criticism for it, for the pacing, the writing, and various aspects of the serial, but I really like it. I love the alien design, the design of the Sensorites. I love the plot line with Susan being telepathic, which is really interesting. It's been built on in the Doctor's character and the Master since then, that this is part of Time Lord or Gallifreyan biology. And it actually gives Susan something cool to do, which she's implied to be really amazingly clever and fun and like a great character in the first episode, and then a lot of episodes after that, she's kind of put in the role of a screaming child who's scared of everything and falls and hurts her leg. In this story, she gets to stand for something, and she shows that she can be a useful part of the TARDIS team. And I really think that this is a standout story for Susan. And if you're a fan of that character or you want to see why people love her, you should check that out. Now, next in the list of classic Doctors is Sylvester McCoy. Now, this was the final Doctor of the regular run of the classic series. He started out very sort of lighthearted, like a showman, which makes sense because he had actually been a children's entertainer before being cast in the role. And as the series went on, he started to go in a darker direction with his portrayal of the Doctor. And really that's where he shines, in his darkness, his layers, where he can pretend to be a goofy clown and then he can destroy a planet and just walk off like nothing happened. He is a great Doctor and a great performer. If you're a fan of the Hobbit series, directed by Peter Jackson, he actually played Radagast in those. I haven't seen them, but I heard he did great. And let's look at some of his stories. Dragonfire is one of the first stories I ever saw starring Sylvester McCoy in the role of the Doctor. It's sort of Dracula in space with like fairy tale aspects and a lot of cool little touches, like they name the ship the Nosferatu, and they have a cool face melting scene. I won't give spoilers as to whose face is melting or when it happens, but it's very reminiscent of Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's a great story. It has Sablom Glitz, who is one of my favorite characters and is a really underrated part of Doctor Who. And it introduces the character of Ace, who is basically your anarcho-communist lesbian punk rocker of the 80s who hates her mom and just wants to blow things up. And she is a fantastic companion. And also it gets rid of Mel, because she leaves at the end of the story. And the Doctor gives a great speech, and Mel gets to not be there anymore, which is great because Mel is a terrible companion. And then Remembrance of the Daleks, it wasn't actually the official 25th anniversary story, but it really feels like it. It's a great Dalek story with a really surprising ending, which is incredibly powerful, and something you're not going to forget anytime soon. I'm not going to get into details because I don't want to spoil it for you. And we have The Curse of Fenric, which is a great story about sort of eldritch horror. Fenric is this powerful being the Doctor has done battle with before, and he has to come head-to-head with him in this final battle to pretty much save the world. And it has some really small, touching moments you might not expect with that premise. It's a great story for Ace's character. We get a lot of development there, and if you don't feel something, or at least get a little bit scared during it, maybe Doctor Who might not be for you, or at least the classic era. And finally, I would suggest Survival, which is the final regular serial of the classic era of Doctor Who. It's a great story featuring the Master. It's well shot. It's got a great soundtrack. And really, most of the things I'd like to praise about it, I don't want to get into unless you've already seen it, because there are some things which you want to be surprised. And it's not that there's any major twists, it's just that it's very poetic storytelling, which is a nice focus on where the Doctor's character is, where the series is at the time, and where Ace has been going for all her adventures with the Doctor and what it's finally leading to. Now, with my fourth Doctor in the classic era, I've got Colin Baker. Now, Colin is regularly ranked as the weakest or worst Doctor in the entire history of the series. I disagree, as you can probably tell. He is a really good Doctor. Now, I don't blame people for putting him at the bottom. I do think it's a shame that he's in these lists and he's been hurt by this. But his first story, or in particular the beginning of his first story, isn't a great opening for a Doctor. We see him pretty much insult his previous incarnation, which alienates the Fifth Doctor's fans, Peter Davison. And Then he goes on to pretty much behave like a manic, insane person, and he freaks out and tries to strangle his companion, which isn't nice, and it doesn't lead you to trust him. Like, they were sort of going for what Peter Capaldi's Doctor was, which is an edgy, sort of angry, brash character. But they took it a little bit too far. And then he puts on a clown suit. Like, his suit just is all the colors of the rainbow spit out, and ugly, ugly suit. But I kind of like it. I think if he had been better appreciated as the Doctor, that would have been considered kind of eccentric and weird, but it wouldn't be hated so much as it is now. I don't love the costume, but it could have worked. And as his stories went on, they tried to soften him a little bit, but they don't really ever accomplish that. He's done some audio plays for Big Finish, which is a great company, and in those, his Doctor has improved a lot, to the point where he is just one of the best takes on the character ever. Now, what I would suggest you view/listen to for Colin Baker would be Vengeance on Varos, which is a serial that's basically about violence on TV and in the media and an oppressive government, and it's one of the more violent and dark stories in Doctor Who, but it does it firmly tongue-in-cheek with an awareness of what it is, and it's a commentary on itself more than anything else. Then the Two Doctors, I'm trying to steer away from multi-Doctor stories when I'm suggesting this, because, I mean, Peter Davison has the 5 Doctors, which is great, but the Two Doctors is one of the best stories of Colin Baker's era, and it has Patrick Troughton returning, and it's not the best multi-Doctor story, but it's a lot of fun. Fraser Hines is back as Jamie. It's a cool little story that goes in directions you wouldn't expect. It's kind of all a metaphor for vegetarianism. I'm not a vegetarian, but it's still very well written. And if you are a vegetarian, you might appreciate it more than I do. And going forward, we've got Attack of the Cybermen, which is a really underrated story that kind of delves deep into the canon of Doctor Who and the Cybermen, which is probably part of why it didn't work, because I think a lot of the audience at the time didn't know deep canon facts about Doctor Who, and they weren't really interested in the story revolving around that. But I think it's a lot of fun, and once you've gotten into Doctor Who a little bit more, you watch the earlier stories, I would suggest you go back and watch this. And it's the only story where the TARDIS actually changes into something other than the police box, which is weird, but they switch it back. If they had kept it, then I would probably hate this story, as it would have been pretty much the death of Doctor Who. Now, my last 2 suggestions for the 6th Doctor are Jubilee and The Holy Terror, which are both really great audio plays from Big Finish. Jubilee is actually the basis of the Dalek, the episode with Christopher Eccleston, and it's not so similar that you have to kind of retcon one out for them both to work, but it has the same premise of a singular Dalek and the emotions and looking at Daleks as characters rather than some big threat that's all the same thing. And this one is kind of set in a parallel timeline and has Doctor Who war movies, so it's got a lot of its own stuff. So if you feel like, hey, I've watched Dalek, I don't want to check out Jubilee, you're really wrong. You should give it a shot. And The Holy Terror is a really chilling story about religion and like pain and wrongdoing and punishment, but also it's got a talking penguin named Frobisher, who is really funny and great, and just listen to it. He is fantastic. Now, I believe I said that Colin Baker was number 4 on my list. He's actually number 5. Sorry if I misspoke or if I'm correcting needlessly right now. I'm trying to do this in one take. Number 4 on my list of classic doctors is Paul McGann, who was arguably not a classic doctor, as he didn't appear in the original run of the TV show, but instead shows up in the TV movie. Sylvester McCoy regenerates into him, and they try to do this TV movie as a pilot for his series. Then they don't pick it up, so he's got that audio plays, and then he appears for 7 minutes as a little mini episode for the 50th anniversary. Now, I love his incarnation of the Doctor. He's sort of, in an interview once he said he was inspired by the idea of like vampirism, where the Doctor was this Lestat-esque figure who didn't age like us and was outside the confines of time. And he's this romantic Doctor who is inspired by the previous incarnations, but has this new, young, excited aspect to him that's kind of similar to what you get with the 10th Doctor. And he's just great. The first thing I'd suggest is the TV movie, which isn't actually very good, but we get to see him sort of coming into his own and figure out who he is as the Doctor, and he gives a great performance. Even if you hate everything else about the TV movie, he is so good in it. Then we've got the second thing I'd suggest would actually be Storm Warning, which is his first audio, just to get a feel for what they're trying to do with his story. Then Minuet in Hell, which is the return of the Brigadier. This is another audio play for Big Finish. And it's kind of cheesy. It's got a bunch of bad American accents, but the Brigadier's in there. It's got weird demon aliens and a parody of evangelical Christians. And it's very entertaining and funny and dark. And it's a great story for Paul McGann. And really, Minuet in Hell is Doctor Who as a B horror movie. And if you like Doctor Who and B-budget horror movies or psychological horror, then you're going to like this. So check it out. Try to ignore the bad American accents, because there are a lot of them, and I just find them funny. Now, what I would suggest next would be the Chimes of Midnight, which is an audio play. It's like a dark Christmas special with a very interesting villain I don't want to give away, and a time loop, and suicidal, a bunch of talk about suicide and death, and it's very Christmassy, and just a great listen, and I would definitely suggest it if you want something really sad and disturbing and upsetting to listen to at Christmas or any time. Now, the final thing I'd want to mention to you is to watch The Night of the Doctor. This is a mini episode which was made for the 50th anniversary. So it was an episode not actually made during his era, but in this he regenerates into the War Doctor. It's sort of like the Caves of Androzani in miniature. I didn't think of that. Someone else did. I read it in an article a while back, and I just stole it. But check it out. I don't want to give any spoilers away. It's so good. It's just a gift to the fans. Now, in third place is the third Doctor, Jon Pertwee. Now, what I would suggest first to view is Spearhead from Space, which is his first story, and is fantastic. It's a great, fun adventure. It doesn't have the Master in it, which is a shame, because the Master does pretty much everything else I love in his era in this story. So if it just had the Master, it would kind of encapsulate everything great about the Third Doctor's era. But it has the Brigadier, it has Liz Shaw, who is my favorite companion of the Third Doctor, and it is a really great story. The Autons are in it. The Third Doctor shows up after having just regenerated. He's put in a hospital. He tries to escape and ends up becoming the unit scientific advisor because he can't use his TARDIS due to a trial he was put on. It's just a really great story that sets up the Third Doctor's era perfectly, and I really would suggest it. And then the second thing I would suggest is something that is nothing like most of his era. It's the Carnival of Monsters. It's a really interesting story set on a ship that is really in space, that is really inside a device that miniaturizes things, and there's monsters, and I and it's a kind of a story about human and animal rights. He's incredibly fun. The special effects aren't great, particularly in this one, but even then, I appreciate the design they were trying for some of their monsters, the Drashigs, and it's a great story that sort of gives you a different take on what the Third Doctor's era could have been had he not spent so much time on Earth. Moving forward, for this second best Doctor in the classic era, Tom Baker. He's often ranked as either the number one or second best Doctor ever. But for me, he is one of the best Doctors. He just doesn't quite take my number one spot. Now, he was the Doctor for 7 years, which is a big part of why he is so popular. First, he gave a great performance, but also a lot of people, when he was the Doctor, couldn't remember another Doctor. He was on PBS in America and Canada, or public broadcasting in America and Canada. People hadn't seen Doctors before him. He captured their imaginations, and he didn't let go. And he was really great Doctor with big hair and a scarf and just a very eccentric personality. Now, he was the Doctor for 7 years, so there are a lot of stories I could suggest. I'm only going to suggest two. Now, the first one is The Ark in Space, which was from his first season, and a lot of people would suggest Genesis of the Daleks, which is a great story, but I feel that The Ark in Space is a better story. It's sort of like Doctor Who does Alien, and it's very creepy and self-contained, and you can pretty much watch it with no context and love it, and watch it with context and love it even more. Genesis of the Daleks is great. It is one of the strongest stories in Doctor Who's history, but I prefer Ark in Space, and Genesis of the Daleks, I feel, kind of gets the edge in a lot of people's minds because of nostalgia and love for Davros as a character and the Daleks, and because it adds to their mythos, and the Daleks are so core to Doctor Who, a lot of people give that the edge, when the Ark in Space, I think, is better. But watch both. Watch all of Doctor Who, but if you're going to try something, see if you like this Doctor, try the Ark in Space. Now, also, City of Death is really good. It was written by Douglas Adams of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fame. It is entirely filmed in Paris. It's got a cameo from John Cleese. It is incredibly funny. Really, Tom Baker gets to shine with his comedic timing in this story. And it's about an alien trying to steal the Mona Lisa. And I don't want to give anything else away, just watch that. Now, finally, my favorite Doctor for the classic era is Patrick Troughton. Patrick Troughton was the second Doctor, so in a sense he was the first Doctor, because he was the first Doctor playing a character who could change his face, an alien who was not confined to one personality. He was the guy who had to establish that concept, that the Doctor could change. He sort of went with a Patrick Troughton-esque character. No, I said Patrick Troughton. Charlie Chaplin, I'm sorry. A Charlie Chaplin-esque character, like the Tramp character. He dressed in a little bit disheveled clothes, but he was still wearing a very nice outfit with a bow tie and checkered trousers. And he played the Recorder. He was just a really goofy character, very similar to the Seventh Doctor. He would pretend to be stupid, an idiot, and then he would use that the fact that villains didn't think much of him to defeat them, because they wouldn't prepare much, they wouldn't expect him to win or to try something, and then he would destroy them. So just a really great character who a lot of the Doctors have been inspired by. Both Matt Smith and Peter Davison have actually mentioned that that's who they first looked to figure out how they wanted to play the Doctor. He is one of the most definitive takes on the role, and it's just a real shame he isn't still alive, because I know he would take every chance he got to do Big Finish, to be in the multi-Doctor stories whenever possible, whether that just be a mini episode like Time Crash. He was a real ambassador for the franchise and just a great actor. He also, I just like him as an actor in general. He was also in The Omen. He played the priest who got speared through the chest, and that film was probably the most iconic scene. And if you are a fan of Harry Potter, actually the actor who plays Dudley is his grandson. So I really suggest you check him out if you're going to check out the classic series at all. His stories are in black and white, so if you don't like that, you might not be as big a fan of him, but I seriously suggest you give it a chance because he just gives a great, humorous, and deep performance that left a real mark on the part and on the show. Now, eventually I'm going to get around to ranking the new era Doctors, and maybe one day I will rank the non-canon or alternative canon Doctors. But thank you for watching, for sticking through this. In the comments, if you would like to tell me who your favorite classic Doctor is, we can see if we agree or if we disagree. And if you feel this list is just completely wrong and you hate everything about it, tell me why. You know what to do. Like, subscribe, and you have a good one. Bye. By the way, I almost forgot, my favorite Patrick Troughton stories, which I would suggest to anyone, are The Mind Robber and The Tomb of the Cybermen, two absolute classics.